For years, the silence in the house was louder than any noise Clara had ever heard. It wasn't a peaceful silence, the kind you find in a library or a quiet forest. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that covered everything. In the center of the living room stood the cause of it all, a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, polished to a shine, with black and white keys that looked like teeth waiting to bite. To anyone else, it was a piece of furniture, maybe even a treasure. But to Clara, it had become a tombstone. Clara used to be a queen of that stage. When she was younger, her hands would fly across the keys, creating magic that made people cry and cheer in the same breath. She played in the biggest halls in Europe. She wore long gowns and bowed to standing ovations. She felt like she was touching the sky when she played. But that felt like a different lifetime now. That Clara was young, confident, and steady. This Clara was old, tired, and falling apart. It started slowly. At first, it was just a tiny twitch in her left thumb when she was relaxed. She didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just tired from practicing too much. But then, the twitch spread. It moved to her other hand. It wasn't just a twitch anymore. It was a shake. A relentless, rhythmic trembling that she couldn't turn off. The doctors called it an essential tremor. They gave it a name which made it feel official, but they couldn't give her a cure. They told her it was progressive, meaning it would only get worse. They told her it was neurological, meaning it was happening in her brain, not her muscles. Her brain was sending signals that her hands couldn't decipher. Living with the tremor, it's like living with a stranger who had taken over her body. The simplest tasks became mountains to climb. Clara remembered the morning she tried to make a cup of tea. She held the fine china cup, a gift from a fan years ago, and her hand began to sway. The tea spilled over the saucer, scalding her skin, and then the cup smashed onto the floor. She stood there, staring at the broken pieces, tears mixing with the spilled tea. She felt humiliated. She was alone in her own kitchen, defeated by a teacup. After that, Clara started to hide. She stopped going out. She stopped seeing her friends. She wore long sleeves even in the summer, trying to cover the trembling hands that she felt everyone was staring at. She felt like a fake. All her life, her identity was tied to her hands. They were her tools, her voice, her gift. Now, they felt like enemies. She felt betrayed by her own body. The piano in the living room became the elephant in the room. For months, Clara couldn't even walk past it without feeling a knot in her stomach. She would look at the keyboard and imagine her fingers hitting the wrong notes. She could hear the discordant, ugly noise in her head before she even touched a key. The thought of sitting on that bench and trying to play, only to fail, was too painful to bear. So, she closed the lid. She put the cloth over it. She tried to pretend it wasn't there. Dust began to settle on the polished wood. It was a sign of how much time had passed. Clara would watch the dust motes dancing in the light that came through the window, and she felt a strange kinship with them. They were drifting, aimless, just like she felt. She sat in her armchair day after day, her hands resting in her lap, shaking slightly even then. She tried to hold them still, pressing them down against her legs, but the vibration never stopped. It was a constant reminder of what she had lost. Sometimes, late at night when the house was dark, Clara would hear music in her head. She would hear the complex sonatas, the sweeping arpeggios, the soft, gentle lullabies. In her mind, her hands were perfect again. She could feel the smooth ivory keys. She could feel the power of the music flowing through her. But then she would wake up, or the lights would flicker on, and she would see her hands trembling in the dim light. The reality always crashed down on her. The music in her head was perfect, but the music in her world was gone, her family. The few who still lived nearby worried about her. They tried to get her interested in other things. They bought her books on tape. They brought her puzzles. They suggested gardening. But none of it filled the hole where the music used to be. Clara didn't want to listen to stories. She wanted to tell them through her playing. She didn't want to garden. She wanted to cultivate melodies. They meant well, but they didn't understand. To them, she was just an old lady with a medical condition. To her, she was a musician trapped in a broken instrument. There were days when Clara felt angry. She would look at her hands and scream at them, "Stop it. Just stop." She would clench her fists tight, squeezing until her knuckles turned white, trying to force the stillness back into her fingers. But the moment she let go, the shaking would start again, sometimes even worse than before. It was a fight she couldn't win, and the exhaustion was overwhelming. It drained her energy, not just physically, but emotionally. The silence in the house grew deeper. It wasn't just the absence of music. It was the absence of Clara. The spark that used to be in her eyes was fading. She stopped taking care of herself as much as she used to. Why comb her hair if no one was coming over? Why dress up if her hands were just going to ruin the moment anyway? She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, floating through the rooms, waiting for something that would never happen. She remembered the specific feeling of a crescendo, the swell of sound under her fingers, the vibration of the strings rising up through the bench and into her bones. It was a feeling of being alive, of being connected to something huge and universal. Now, the only vibrations she felt were the tremors in her hands. It was a cruel joke. The very part of her that created beauty had become the source of her greatest ugliness. In her eyes, as the seasons changed outside her window, the world kept moving. People went to work, children played in the streets, and somewhere, other pianists were playing concerts. Clara felt left behind, forgotten. The dust on the piano got thicker. It became a symbol of her surrender. She had accepted that her life was over. The chapter on music was closed. The book was closed. She was just existing now, waiting for the end. Trying to ignore the hands that betrayed her and the melody that she could no longer release, she sat in her chair, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a steady, rhythmic sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the only rhythm in her life now. Her hands shook in her lap, keeping their own chaotic time, out of sync with the clock and out of sync with the world. Clara closed her eyes, drifting into the quiet darkness, wishing, just for a moment, that she could be young again, just for one song. But the silence remained heavy and unbroken. The afternoon was gray and sleepy, the kind of day that makes the world look like an old black and white photograph. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the window pane, a soft rhythm that usually made Clara feel calm. But today, her heart was beating a little faster than usual. It wasn't the rain. It was the mail. Clara didn't get much mail anymore. Mostly, it was just bills or flyers for the grocery store. Once in a while, a card would arrive from an old friend, but those were becoming rare as the years went by. She shuffled slowly to the front door, her feet dragging slightly on the carpet. Opening the heavy wooden door took some effort. Her grip wasn't what it used to be. When she finally looked down at the welcome mat, she saw a single white envelope sitting there. It didn't look like a bill. It was too fancy for that. The paper was thick and creamy, with a gold seal pressed into the back. Clara picked it up with her right hand, but as soon as she held it, the familiar tremble began. Her fingers started to dance a little, the envelope wobbling in her grip. She quickly grabbed it with her left hand to steady it, a trick she had learned to hide the shaking. She closed the door with her foot and walked over to the kitchen table. Holding the letter like it was made of glass, she sat down and stared at the front. The handwriting was elegant, swirling, and precise. There was no return address, just the school crest stamped in the corner. Clara froze. She knew that crest. She knew the golden bird with its wings spread wide. It was the logo of the conservatory where she had studied all those years ago. It was the place where she had become the musician she was. It's the place that held her best memories and her proudest moments. With trembling fingers, she used a letter opener to slice the top of the envelope. She had to be careful. If she rushed, the sharp blade might slip because her hand was shaking, and she didn't want to rip whatever was inside. She pulled out the heavy cardstock and began to read. The words were formal, polite, and full of praise. They were organizing a Legends Gala, special evening to honor the students who had graduated and gone on to do great things in the world of music. They were inviting alumni to come back, to share their stories, and to perform. Clara read through the list of names, recognizing a few famous musicians. But she stopped when she saw her own name mentioned in a separate paragraph. They weren't just inviting her to watch. They wanted her to play. The letter went on to say that they wanted her to perform the one piece she was famous for. It was a complex emotional nocturne she had written when she was just a student. A piece that had become famous for its difficult trills and its deep, haunting melody. They called it the Song of the Evening Star. Reading the name of the song made Clara's breath catch in her throat. She sat back in her chair, the letter resting on the table. Her hands were shaking so much now that she had to put them in her lap under the table. A wave of panic washed over her, cold and sharp. Play? They wanted her to play that piece? It was impossible. The Song of the Evening Star wasn't just a song. It was a test of speed and control. It required fingers that moved like lightning, hitting the keys with lightness and precision. Clara's hands didn't move like lightning anymore. They moved like heavy, wet stones. She laughed, but it was a dry, sad sound. It felt like a cruel joke. The universe was playing a trick on her. Here was the chance to go back to her school, to stand on the stage where she had felt like a goddess. But she was being asked to do it without the one thing that made her special, her control. Later that evening, her daughter came to visit. Clara showed her the letter. Her daughter read it slowly, her face changing from a smile to a look of deep worry. When she looked up, her eyes were full of pity. "Mom," she said softly, reaching out to touch Clara's arm. "You can't go. You know that, right?" Clara looked away. "I know," she whispered. "It would be too hard," her daughter continued, her voice gentle but firm. "People will be watching. The critics will be there. What if you can't do it? What if your hands shake too much and you ruin the song? It would break your heart." Clara nodded. She knew her daughter was right. She was trying to protect her. That's what families do. They try to build walls around you to keep you from getting hurt. But Clara also felt a sting of irritation. Her daughter saw a sick old woman who needed to be kept safe. She didn't see the musician who was screaming to be heard. For 3 days, Clara argued with herself. It was a war inside her head. In the morning, she would decide to throw the letter away. She would picture herself on the big stage, the bright spotlight shining down on her, the thousands of eyes watching. She imagined her hands hovering over the keys, shaking violently, unable to hit the right notes. She imagined the silence in the hall, the awkward coughing, the whispers of poor Clara. The humiliation felt unbearable. She would reach for the trash can, ready to forget it all. But then night would fall. The house would get quiet, and the doubts would change shape. Clara would sit in her armchair, looking at the dark shape of the piano in the corner. And she would feel a different kind of pain. It was the pain of regret. She thought about the students at the school. She thought about the young musicians practicing in their rooms, dreaming of being great. She wondered if seeing someone who struggled, someone who was broken, might actually mean something to them. Or maybe it was just for her. Maybe she needed to go not to show them how good she was, but to show herself that she wasn't afraid. On the 4th night, there was a break in the clouds. The rain stopped and the full moon poured into the living room, lighting up the dust on the piano lid. Clara couldn't sleep. She walked over to the window and looked out at the street. It was peaceful. She turned around and looked at the piano again. It had been so long since she had really looked at it. She walked over and reached out. Her hand was trembling just as it always did. She touched the cool wood of the lid. It felt smooth and familiar. She lifted the lid slowly. The sound of the hinge creaking in the silent house was loud, like a gunshot. There were the keys. White and black, waiting. Clara sat down on the bench. It felt harder than she remembered. She placed her hands in her lap, took a deep breath, and then lifted them up to the keyboard. They were shaking. The vibration was visible, her fingers fluttering like leaves in the wind. Just one chord, she thought. Just to see. She pressed down. The sound that came out wasn't perfect. It was a little muddy because her fingers hadn't landed exactly together. But as the sound rang out, filling the empty room, Clara felt a shiver go down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the vibration of the strings. It was the smell of the felt and the wood. It was the feeling of connection. She sat there, holding the chord until the sound faded into nothingness. In that moment, she realized something important. She didn't need to be the perfect pianist she was 40 years ago. That woman was gone. This woman was still here. She still had a heartbeat. She still had memories. And deep down, under the shaking and the fear, the melody was still there. Clara stood up and walked over to the table where the letter lay. She picked up a pen. Her hand shook as she hovered the tip over the paper. It took all her concentration to write the 2 words at the bottom of the reply card. She didn't write, "I will win." She didn't write, "I will be perfect." She simply wrote, "I will come." It was a promise not to the school and not to the audience, but to herself. She was going to walk into the light, even if she had to crawl. She was going to play her song, even if it was broken. Because a broken song, she realized, was still better than total silence. She put the letter in the envelope to mail the next morning. For the first time in a long time, the silence in the house didn't feel so heavy. It felt like a waiting room, and the show was about to begin. Once the letter was sent, the reality of what Clara had promised began to weigh on her. The excitement of the decision faded away, leaving behind a mountain of hard work. The gala was still months away, but for Clara, time was running out. She was an old woman fighting against a body that didn't work the way it used to. Every morning, she woke up with a mix of determination and dread. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the piano stood there waiting for her like a strict judge. In the beginning, practicing was a nightmare. Clara would sit down on the bench, straighten her back, and place her fingers on the keys. But the moment she tried to play the first few notes of the Song of the Evening Star, her hands would betray her. The song started with a slow, gentle melody, but it quickly moved into fast, complicated sections. Her fingers, once agile and quick, now felt heavy and stiff. When she tried to play the fast notes, they would stumble over each other like clumsy runners. The sound was heartbreaking. Instead of a flowing river of music, it sounded like broken glass. A C sharp would hit an E instead of a D. Her thumb would get stuck. The tremor in her right hand would make the notes buzz, creating an ugly, fuzzy sound that made her cringe. She would stop, take a deep breath, and try again. And again. And again. By the end of the first hour, her hands were aching, and her spirit was bruised. Clara decided to practice at night. She didn't want anyone to hear her mistakes. During the day, if the neighbors were out walking their dogs, or if a car drove by with its windows down, she felt paranoid. She was embarrassed. She didn't want the world to hear the great Clara struggling to play a simple scale. So, she waited until the sun went down and the streetlights turned on. She would close all the curtains and turn off the main lights, leaving just a small lamp on the piano to keep the sound down. She even took a thick wool blanket and stuffed it partially inside the top of the piano, resting against the strings. It made the instrument sound dull and soft, like it was far away. It was a lonely sound. It suited her mood. For weeks, this was her routine. She would wake up, drink her tea, and think about the music. She would try to visualize her hands moving perfectly, miming the motions on the kitchen table while the water boiled. But when she sat down to actually play, the illusion shattered. The tremor was worst in the mornings, so she had to wait until late evening to try. Her sleep schedule suffered. She would nap in the afternoons, waking up groggy and confused. Feeling like she was living in a fog, there were nights when she wanted to quit. She would be practicing a particularly difficult measure, section where the left hand had to jump quickly while the right hand played a trill. It was a move she had done 1,000 times in her sleep 30 years ago. Now, it was a wall she couldn't climb. Her left hand would land on the wrong key, a jarring, discordant crash that echoed through the empty house. One rainy Tuesday, something inside her snapped. She had been trying to get past that one measure for an hour. Over and over, she failed. Finally, she slammed her fists down on the keys, creating a loud, chaotic noise that wasn't music at all. She stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do it," she shouted to the empty room. "I am a fool. I am going to make a fool of myself." She walked away from the piano and went to the window. Outside, the rain was pouring down, washing the streets. She felt like her life was washing away, too. She felt old and pathetic. Who was she trying to kid? She wasn't a legend. She was just a sick old woman with a dream that was too big for her. She thought about calling the school the next day, making up an excuse. She could say she broke her arm. She could say she was sick. Anything to avoid the humiliation. But then, she looked back at the piano. The dull thud of the strings still hung in the air. She remembered the feeling of playing that one chord the night she decided to go. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been real. She realized that she wasn't practicing to impress the critics anymore. She wasn't practicing to show off how fast she was. She was practicing to survive. She was practicing to have one last conversation with the thing she loved most in the world before she died. The next day, Clara changed her approach. She stopped trying to force her hands to be young. For weeks, she had been fighting the tremor, trying to tense her muscles to hold her hands still. But tensing up only made it worse. It was like trying to hold a ball of water. The harder she squeezed, the more it slipped away. She sat down and tried to relax. It was harder than it sounded. Her natural instinct was to brace herself, to get ready for the shake. But she forced herself to breathe. She closed her eyes and listened to her breathing, in and out. She let her shoulders drop. She let her arms hang loose at her sides. When she finally placed her hands on the keys, she didn't try to lift her fingers high. She kept them low, close to the wood. She played a single note. It was clearer. The shaking was still there, but because she wasn't fighting it, it wasn't jerking the note around as much. It was a steady vibration. She realized she couldn't rely on her fingers to do all the work anymore. Her fingers were too weak and unsteady. She had to use her arms. She remembered an old technique her teacher had mentioned years ago about arm weight. Instead of hitting the keys with the strength of her fingers, she would lean into them. She would let the weight of her arm drive the note down. This was dangerous. If you lean too much, you hit too many keys. You get mushy sounds. But it was the only chance she had. It was a desperate gamble. She started slowly, very slowly. She played a simple scale, letting the weight of her arm roll from one note to the next. It felt heavy. It felt clumsy. But as she moved from note to note, the tremor seemed to get absorbed by the movement. She wasn't stopping the shake. She was riding it. Over the next few weeks, Clara began to rebuild the song. She didn't try to play it at the correct speed. She played it incredibly slowly, like a turtle walking through mud. If she tried to speed up, the tremors would take over, and the music would fall apart. So she accepted the slowness. She focused on making every single note sing. Even if it took her 10 seconds to play a phrase that used to take 2, it was a slow, painful process. She treated it like physical therapy. Her brain had to relearn how to talk to her hands. She had to find new pathways, new ways of moving that bypassed the broken parts of her nervous system. There were moments of beauty, small victories that kept her going. One night she played a chord progression in the middle of the song. She used her arm weight, pressing into the keys with a firm, heavy touch. The sound that came out wasn't sharp and tinkling like a music box. It was deep, resonant, and warm, like a cello. It was a different sound than she used to make, but it was beautiful in its own way. She held the chord, listening to the vibrations hum through the floorboards. And for a moment she didn't feel the shaking. She also started to change how she thought about the melody. The song of the evening star was supposed to be light and airy, like a star twinkling in the sky. But Clara couldn't twinkle anymore. She had to make it about the vastness of the sky, the deep darkness behind the stars. She played the melody with a heavier, more emotional weight. It sounded sadder, more fragile, but incredibly human. Her fingers still looked like they were in a constant state of vibration. If she held her hand up, it fluttered wildly. But when she touched the keys, the contact seemed to ground her. The piano became her anchor. She practiced until her back hurt and her eyes burned. She practiced until she could play the whole song from start to finish, even if it was at half speed. She memorized the feeling of the keys, the resistance of the springs, the texture of the ivory. She learned where the trouble spots were and how to navigate around them. There was one section, right before the end, where the music built up to a climax. It required a lot of power. Clara was terrified of this part. She was afraid she would miss the big chords and ruin the ending. She practiced that section more than anything else. She would play the 3 leading chords over and over hundreds of times a night. She built up her strength. She learned to trust that even if her hand was shaking, if she committed to the movement with her whole arm, the chord would sound. One evening, about a month before the gala, Clara played through the entire piece without stopping. It wasn't perfect. There were slips. There were moments where the tone wavered, but she didn't stop. She didn't cry. She didn't slam the fists. She just kept playing. When she hit the final chord, she didn't lift her hands immediately. She sat there, leaning into the piano, pressing the keys down, letting the sound fade into the silence of the night. She pulled her hands back. They were trembling violently, twitching in the air, but her heart was calm. She looked at the clock. It was past midnight. She was exhausted, her muscles screaming, but she felt a strange sense of peace. She hadn't conquered the tremor. It was still there, and it always would be. But she had found a way to live with it, to make music with it. She stood up, covered the piano keys, and turned off the lamp. The house was dark again. But the fear was gone. Clara knew that when she walked onto that stage, she wouldn't be the same pianist the audience remembered. She would be someone else, someone older, someone broken, but someone who had fought harder than she ever had in her life. She packed her sheet music away. She didn't need it anymore. The melody was inside her, etched into her memory. The evening of the gala arrived faster than Clara had expected. The days of practice in her dark, quiet living room had melted away, and now the reality was staring her in the face. It was the kind of night where the air felt crisp and heavy with anticipation. Outside her window, the city was glowing with yellow streetlights. But inside her bedroom, the atmosphere was tense. Clara stood in front of her full-length mirror, staring at a woman she barely recognized. She was wearing a long velvet dress, the color of deep midnight blue. It was an old dress, one she hadn't worn in 20 years. Miraculously, it still fit, though her body had changed. Her shoulders were a little more rounded, her posture a little more fragile. She pinned her silver hair up in a style that used to look elegant, but now she worried it just looked severe. She applied a bit of lipstick, her hand trembling slightly as she brought the tube to her mouth, leaving a tiny, wobbly smear that she had to wipe away and fix. She looked at her hands. They were the only things that didn't belong in this glamorous picture. They looked old, the skin thin and spotted with age. They were shaking, constantly shaking, even when she rested them on the vanity table. She grabbed a small silk shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders, making sure the ends draped over her hands. It was her shield. If she could hide her hands until the very last second, she could pretend, just for a little while longer, that she was the old Clara. The car ride to the conservatory was quiet. The driver was polite, but he didn't know who she was. To him, she was just another elderly lady going to a fancy event. Clara watched the city lights blur past the window. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to tell the driver to turn around, to take her back home, to the safety of her armchair and her silence. But she didn't speak. She gripped her purse tight with both hands to keep them from shaking visibly. When they arrived, the building looked magnificent. Large stone pillars held up the entrance, and golden light spilled out from the open doors. Red carpet led up the steps, and people were swarming everywhere, men in tuxedos and women in sparkling gowns. Clara took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out. As soon as she entered the hall, she was hit by a wall of noise. It was a mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of hundreds of conversations. The air smelled of expensive perfume, flowers, and floor wax. Clara felt small. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, nodding politely at people who stared at her. Some recognized her immediately. She saw the look in their eyes, a mix of surprise and pity. "Is that her?" she heard someone whisper. She looked so frail. She found her way to the backstage area, escaping the noise of the lobby. The hallway here was dimly lit and smelled of old dust and floorboards. It was a familiar smell, one that brought back a flood of memories. She remembered running down these halls as a girl, sheet music in hand, late for a lesson. She remembered the sound of a dozen pianos being played at once. A chaotic storm of music. Backstage, It was a different world. Musicians were tuning instruments, vocalists were doing warm-up scales, and stagehands were rushing around with cables and lights. Clara sat in a corner chair, clutching her shawl around her. She watched a young violinist practicing a difficult run. The girl was in her 20s, full of energy and confidence. Her fingers flew over the strings with blinding speed. Clara felt a pang of jealousy, sharp and bitter. That used to be her. She had that fire once. Now, she just felt tired. A few other alumni came over to say hello. They were people she had known decades ago. They had aged, too. Their hair was gray, their faces lined, but they seemed different. They seemed happy. They chatted about their grandchildren, their retirement, their gardens. Clara tried to smile and nod, but she felt distant. She wasn't there to chat about gardens. She was there to go to war. She felt like a soldier waiting for the battle to begin, while everyone else was at a picnic. "Clara," a man said, bending down to talk to her. It was an old friend, a cellist. "It is so good to see you. You look wonderful." "Thank you," Clara said softly. Her voice sounded thin. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently. Clara looked at him. She could see the concern in his eyes. He knew about her condition. Everyone did. "I am just trying to remember the notes," she lied. He patted her shoulder. "It will be fine. Just enjoy the moment. We are all rooting for you." His kindness almost made her cry. She didn't want his pity. She wanted his respect. But she knew that right now, she was an object of curiosity. The tragic pianist returning to the stage one last time. Then, the lights in the theater dimmed. The hum of the audience in the main hall died down. A stagehand appeared in the doorway. "Miss Clara, you are on after the next introduction. It's time to go to the side wing." Clara stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She walked slowly to the side of the stage, hidden by the heavy velvet curtains. From there, she could see the audience. It was a sea of heads, rows upon rows, stretching back to the darkness. In the center sat the critics, some of them the same men who had reviewed her concerts 40 years ago. They were older now, too, but they still held their pens like weapons. The announcer walked out to the microphone. The spotlight hit him, and he began to speak. He talked about the history of the school, the importance of music, and the legacy of the alumni. Then his tone changed. He began to introduce Clara. He spoke of her triumphs, her technique, her famous compositions. He didn't mention her illness. He treated her like the legend she used to be. "And now," the announcer said, his voice booming through the speakers, "please welcome back to the stage the woman who wrote the Song of the Evening Star." Clara, there was a polite round of applause. It wasn't a roar, but it wasn't silence either. Clara took a breath that felt like she was inhaling water. She stepped out from behind the curtain. The sudden brightness of the spotlight was blinding. She couldn't see the audience anymore. She just saw a wall of white light. The floor of the stage was polished and slippery. She had planned to walk with dignity, head high, but she found herself looking down at her feet, watching her step carefully. She felt unbalanced, like a leaf in the wind. The walk to the piano felt like it took a lifetime. With every step, she was aware of hundreds of eyes fixed on her back. She knew they were watching her hands. As she got closer to the piano, she let the shawl slip from her shoulders. She didn't need it anymore. There was nowhere to hide. She reached the bench. It was a simple black stool, adjusted to the height she had requested. She turned to face the audience for a brief moment. The blinding light blocked her view of their faces, but she could feel them. She could feel the silence. It was a heavy, expectant silence. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of holding one's breath, waiting for a crash. She turned back to the piano and sat down. The bench was firm. She smoothed the fabric of her dress over her knees, a nervous habit. Then she slowly lifted her hands and placed them on the keyboard. The trembling was worse than it had ever been. Perhaps it was the adrenaline, or the cold air of the hall, or the sheer terror. Her hands were shaking visibly, vibrating over the keys. From the darkness of the audience, a few quiet gasps could be heard. Someone shifted in their seat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara stared at the keys. They looked white and unforgiving. She felt a surge of panic. "I can't do this," a voice screamed in her head. Asterisk, look at them. They are shaking too much. I will ruin it. I will make a fool of myself. Asterisk. She wanted to stand up and run. She wanted to disappear through the floor. But then she felt the texture of the ivory under her fingertips. It was cool and smooth. It was real. She remembered the nights at home, playing in the dark. She remembered the feeling of the arm weight, the heavy, grounded sound she had learned to make. She closed her eyes. She shut out the lights, the audience, the critics, and the fear. She blocked everything out except the rhythm of her own breathing. In, out, in, out. She pictured the song in her mind. Not as a technical challenge, but as a story. A story of the night sky, of loneliness, and of the light that eventually breaks through. Her hands were still shaking, hovering over the keys like nervous birds. But she didn't pull them back. She waited for the internal shaking of her heart to match the shaking of her hands. And for a split second, they seemed to align. The chaos became a rhythm. Clara took a deep final breath. She stopped fighting the tremor. She accepted it as part of her, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she pressed down the first chord. It was a fraction of a second late, but the sound that rang out was deep, resonant, and shockingly clear. The silence of the hall shattered, and Clara began to play. As the first chord faded into the air of the grand hall, Clara felt a strange sensation wash over her. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It wasn't a wall stopping her anymore. It was a fire behind her, pushing her forward. She moved her fingers to play the opening melody of the Song of the Evening Star. This was the part that was supposed to be light and airy, like stars twinkling in a clear night sky. Her fingers couldn't twinkle. They stumbled slightly on the third note, creating a tiny hesitation. In the past, in her youth, this would have made her angry. She would have cursed herself for the imperfection. But tonight, the hesitation didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a gasp. It sounded like someone waking up from a long, sad dream. It was fragile, incredibly fragile, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. The tremor in her hands was still strong. It was constant, a relentless vibration that she couldn't turn off. But Clara didn't try to fight it anymore. Instead of trying to hold her hands perfectly still, she let them ride the waves of the shake. She pressed the keys down with the weight of her arms, letting the tremor press into the wood and the strings. The result was a sound that buzzed and hummed. It wasn't a clean, artificial sound like you hear on a radio recording. It was a raw, vibrating sound, thick with emotion. It sounded like a human voice trembling with tears. The audience sat in stunned silence. The critics, the ones who had come with their sharp pencils and their skeptical minds, found themselves unable to write. They stopped thinking about technique. They stopped counting the mistakes. Usually, when you listen to a piano, you listen for the crispness of the notes. But tonight, they were listening to the struggle. They could hear that every note was a battle. They could feel the effort it took for her just to touch the keys. It wasn't just music. It was a display of pure human will. They were witnessing a woman refusing to be silenced by her own body. Clara moved deeper into the song. The music became more complex. The left hand had to play a steady, rolling rhythm, while the right hand played a fast, dancing tune. In the past, her right hand would have flown like a bird, swift and graceful. Tonight, it felt like the bird was fighting a strong wind. She played the notes heavier than she intended, landing on them with a thud instead of a tap. But she kept the rhythm going. She leaned into the piano, using her shoulder strength to push her fingers down. The sound that came out was deep and resonant. It filled every corner of the huge hall. It wasn't pretty in the traditional, polite sense. It was intense. It was heavy. It felt like a thunderstorm rolling in over the horizon. The music wasn't just a melody anymore. It was a conversation between Clara and her suffering. She was playing her anger, her frustration, and her sadness. The piano was her outlet, roaring with a voice that her throat no longer had. She closed her eyes, shutting out the blinding spotlight. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the past. She saw herself as a young girl, full of arrogance and confidence, practicing for hours until her fingers bled. She saw the years of silence in her dusty living room. She saw the broken teacups and the days she spent hiding in shame. She poured all of those memories into the keys. She wasn't playing a composition anymore. She was telling her life story. Every wobble of her hand was a word in that story. Then came the moment she had feared the most, the climax of the piece. The music was supposed to build up to a fast, chaotic explosion of sound. Clara knew she didn't have the speed for that anymore. She couldn't play the notes as fast as the sheet music demanded. So, she changed it. She slowed down the tempo just a fraction. Instead of a chaotic blur, she played massive heavy chords. She lifted her shaking hands high above the keyboard and brought them down with all the force she could muster. Boom, boom, boom. The sound was massive. It wasn't clean. There was a little blur, a little overlapping of notes, because she couldn't stop the shaking fast enough. But it didn't matter. It didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like thunder. It sounded like the ocean crashing against the rocks. It felt powerful. It felt like she was shaking her fist at the disease that had tried to ruin her life. She hit the keys again and again, her arms trembling with the effort, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no longer a frail old woman. She was a giant. She was using the tremor to create the sound. The chaos in her hands was becoming the chaos in the music, and it was beautiful. She reached the final section. The storm passed, and the music became quiet again. She played the last few notes, one by one, slowly. They were delicate, hanging in the air like raindrops falling from a roof. Her hands were exhausted. Her muscles were burning, screaming for her to stop, but she held on. She pressed the final key, a low, deep note, and she leaned her whole body into it, holding it down. Sustaining the sound, she pressed the sustain pedal with her foot, and the strings inside the piano vibrated against the wood. The sound swirled around the hall, echoing off the walls, wrapping itself around the people in the audience. In that moment, nobody was breathing. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. The pain, the shaking, the agit all ceased to exist. There was only the sound. It was a sound that seemed to suspend time itself. It felt like the note would never end, stretching on into eternity. Finally, the sound faded into nothingness. Clara lifted her hands from the keys. The moment her fingers left the ivory, the trembling returned, sharp and violent. Her hands shook wildly in the air, no longer grounded by the music. She pulled them back into her lap and sat there, looking at the dark wood of the piano, waiting. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The hall was absolutely, perfectly silent. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a holy silence. It was the kind of silence you feel after a prayer or after witnessing something miraculous. The audience was frozen, unable to break the spell. They weren't clapping because they were too moved. They were processing what they had just seen. They realized they hadn't just heard a performance. They had watched a triumph of the human spirit. Then, from the very back of the hall, someone clapped. Just one single clap. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. Then, like a dam breaking, the noise came. It started as a ripple and turned into a roar. People surged to their feet. They weren't just clapping politely. They were shouting. They were cheering with a raw energy that the old hall had probably never heard. The critics were on their feet, throwing their pencils aside. Her old friends were crying, wiping their eyes with handkerchiefs. They weren't cheering because she was perfect. They were cheering because she was real. They were cheering because she had refused to disappear. They were cheering for the beauty that can be found in broken things. Clara slowly turned around on the bench. Her legs felt weak, like jelly, but she managed to stand up. The spotlight was blinding again, piercing her eyes, but she didn't squint. She looked out into the darkness where the sound was coming from. She didn't try to hide her hands this time. She let them hang at her sides, trembling freely for everyone to see. She didn't feel ashamed. She felt proud. She bowed her head slightly. It wasn't a deep theatrical bow like she used to do. It was a small, simple nod of gratitude. She was thanking them for listening, but she was also thanking the music for letting her speak one last time as she walked off the stage. The applause followed her. It washed over her back like a warm wave. She passed the stagehands, who were usually so serious and focused. Tonight, they were smiling, looking at her with genuine respect. One young man, holding a microphone cable, mouthed the words "wow" as she passed by. Clara smiled back at him, a tired but genuine smile that reached her eyes. She walked down the long, dark hallway backstage, leaving the bright lights behind. The noise of the crowd faded as the heavy stage door closed behind her. She was alone in the quiet corridor again. Clara leaned against the wall for a moment, catching her breath. Her heart was still beating fast, thumping hard against her ribs. But for the first time in years, it wasn't beating with anxiety. It wasn't beating with fear. It was beating with the thrill of being alive. She looked down at her hands in the dim light of the corridor. They were still shaking. They would always shake. The disease hadn't magically disappeared. She would still struggle to hold a teacup tomorrow. She would still have trouble buttoning her coat. The world hadn't changed, but she had changed. She looked at her trembling hands and didn't see enemies anymore. She saw the tools that had carried her through the hardest performance of her life. They were old, they were shaky, and they were imperfect, but they had done the job. They had carried the melody. Clara pushed herself off the wall and stood up straight. She took a deep breath, smelling the familiar smell of dust and old wood. The silence in the hallway wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. She knew that the tremors would be there when she woke up in the morning. But tonight, for those few minutes on the stage, she had been bigger than her body. She had been timeless. And as she walked towards her dressing room, she began to hum a quiet tune, keeping the melody alive step by step into the night.